Anyway, we're going to start off with member introductions. This is going to be an in-depth introduction. You're going to give us a short biography of your life. Do you believe in anything you say?
Yes.
Good.
All right.
Actually, what we want to know is who you are, what you do, and who you represent. So I guess we'll start out with me. My name is Bruce Woodruff. I'm the town planner in Milton. And I'm very old.
Is that what you do or what you represent?
Which direction would you go?
Then we're going to do the Zoom screen.
All right.
I'm Michael Williams. I represent Coast, and I'm the Director of Operations.
I'm Katrin Casper. I'm a select person in the town of Wheaton.
Michelle Mears, yes, I'm Director of Planning and Community Development.
I'm Vanessa Price. I'm the town planner for the town of Barrington.
We want to go to, we'll just go down the top. Megan, introduce yourself.
Megan Taylor-Fetter, SRPC.
Chris,
Chris Jacobs, Town Administrator from Milton, New Hampshire.
Tim,
Good morning, everybody. Tim White, Mobile Services Supervisor, New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. I am also old.
Jessica,
Good morning. I work with the old guy, Tim White, over there. I work at New Hampshire DES and I coordinate the Granite State Clean Cities Coalition. Hi, everybody.
Rachel,
Morning, Rachel Dewey, SRPC.
Kim,
Good morning. This is Kim Rumo from DOT. I work in planning.
Ricky,
Hi, Ricky DeSillo, NHDES. I work with Jessica and Tim, and I think I'm not old.
There you go.
It's a matter of time.
Michael Moser,
Hi, my name is Michael Moser. I'm the Chief of Design Services at DOT. I'm also the project manager for the DOT on the NEVI funding guidance. So welcome. Thank you, everybody.
you have it here. Jackson,
Hi, Jackson Rand with SRPC.
Lee, Lee Levine,
Hi, sorry about that. Yes, Lee Levine here from Federal Highway Administration, and apologies in advance. I have another meeting at 9:30, so I'll have to leave early.
okay, no worries. Last couple, Stephen,
Stephen Geis, SRPC.
and Susie,
Zuzi Duffy, SRPC.
and I'm Colin Lentz, Transportation Planner with Stratford Regional Plan.
Jen says Director at Stratford Regional Planning.
All right, thanks, everybody. I guess we're going to move on to staff communications. That's item number 2 on the agenda.
I can't think of anything new since the last time that's official.
Okay. So we're going to move on to item 3. That's action items. That's minutes from March 4th. It should be the second thing in your packet.
So we can't do those without.
All right, so we're going to skip that.
We'll skip it.
We need a motion, or we're all set. We're going to do it next time.
Yeah, have to do it next
So
time.
that moves us on to item 4. We're really rolling. Discussion items, and under A, it's preparing for electric vehicle charging. And this should be Jessica.
Yep. Thank you, Jessica, for being on hand again. I know I feel like I'm learning on the fly with all of this. The funding on its way and the increased emphasis on EV charging. So I'm grateful for Jessica to be here and be an expert and give us a bit more of the information.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Colin, and thanks everybody for your time this morning. Good to see you all. And welcome to Mike Moser with New Hampshire DOT. I'm going to be covering, obviously, some major funding that's coming down the pike that Mike's going to be playing a major role in. So, you know, I've been talking to this group for several years now, and generally coming to you and you know, promoting electric vehicles and EV charging opportunities in New Hampshire. And now we have this historic moment in time where 1.2 trillion funding opportunity through the bipartisan infrastructure law is really dedicating some major funding towards building a pathway for EVs across the nation and particularly in our state, and building out this EV infrastructure that we've been talking about. So as you all know, I am the transportation specialist for the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and a coordinator our State Clean Cities Coalition, which you know, one of our target audiences is working with communities here in New Hampshire, businesses, schools that are interested in transitioning to alternative fuels, particularly electric vehicles. There is my contact information. Many of you know me, so we'll move on here. You guys know the case for EVs. Transportation is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And when you electrify transportation, even when you factor in power plant emissions, we're obviously aware that EVs just are cleaner. They come out on the other side cleaner. Driving EVs still, compared to gasoline today, I think this is an outdated photo, still much cheaper to drive EVs with a gasoline gallon equivalent than to pay for gas at the pump. And what we're seeing is this trend of growth in EV registrations here in our state, with particularly a focus on growth in the communities of the counties of Hillsborough and Rockingham and Cheshire and Stratford. So good to see that growth. And obviously, as we continue to see investments in electrification by major mainstream automakers and this beginning of this transition to electrify vehicles that we're familiar with, right? Pickup trucks, SUVs, we anticipate that adoption rate will continue to grow. And that market is growing beyond light duty. So when we talk about EV infrastructure, we're also trying to think about EV infrastructure to support the growth of fleets and vehicles and size into the medium and heavy duty market of pickup trucks, box trucks, and vans. So just a real quick EV 101, you're going to hear me use the term EV, and that's electric vehicle, and EVSE, which is basically EV charging. And as you may already know, there's 3 different types. Level 1, basically a 120 volt wall outlet. So your standard 3-prong household plug, and every EV comes with a level 1 charger. They can plug into this 3-prong wall outlet and get 2 to 5 miles of range for every hour. But where the focus for the funding that we're currently dealing with, that we currently have access to here in the state, which is the Volkswagen funds, and now the funding coming through the infrastructure law, that focus is really going to be on the faster charging. So direct current fast charging, some people call it level 3. It is not. It's DCFC fast charging, and we typically see that in 3 different types. 50 kilowatts, which used to be a fast charging for DCFC, and now it's kind of on the low end because we're moving into this 150 kilowatt and ranges of 350 kilowatt, and EVs now are being made to accept this higher speed of charging. We're also seeing an interest in co-locating level 2 with some of these DC fast chargers through the VW funding. Level 2 gives you about 10 to 25 miles of range for every hour of charging. So level 2 kind of great for communities around our state because it invites the EV driver to come into the community, visit your stores, eat in the restaurants, and kind of hang around in our communities here. Whereas the DC fast charging, great along highway interstates. I'm going to see that that's where that focus for that funding really is targeting. One thing to keep in mind with direct current fast charging is that there are 3 different types of connectors. Tesla has its own proprietary connector. Think of the Hooksett fast chargers at the rest areas there in Hooksett. Then we have direct current fast chargers that up till now have really come equipped with 2 different types of connectors. The SAE combined charging system, or CCS, which basically supports all of the American-made electric vehicles, and then the CHAdeMO connector, which has up till now supported Nissan and Mitsubishi, But even those two automakers are moving away from CHAdeMO. So we're starting to see a push now to really embrace that SAE combined charging system as a standard. So up till now, some of the challenges have been that with level 2 charging, there's a standard connector. It's called a J1772. But with level 3 charging, we've been dealing with 3 different connector types. So now what we're seeing coming through the funding is an attempt to maybe standardize that. Existing DC fast charging infrastructure here in New Hampshire really does not fit the bill. As we're seeing, most of it is targeting, is built out on the seacoast and then along our Vermont border in the Upper Valley, and currently only 15 universal DC fast charging locations. So these are 15 sites that anyone driving in any EV can pull up to and access charging. You know, for reference, so we have 15 here in the state. For reference, our surrounding states like Vermont basically have double that, and Massachusetts has 92 direct current fast charging. So there's been a lot of investment in building those out in our surrounding states. So we've got some catching up to do, right? For level 2 charging here in the state, once again, we kind of see this gap, particularly in the northern tier of our state, where there really is one, maybe one level 2 charging location, you know, close to our Canadian border there. So we have about 122 level 2 chargers currently in the state. Vermont, Maine, pretty much double, and then Massachusetts again blowing us out of the water with nearly 2,000 locations. So, you know, we know that even in those states, they're playing catch up. So once again, we've got some catching up to do. So that's where we've been really promoting our Volkswagen settlement funds, or the Volkswagen mitigation trust funding that's come to our state. So real quick background, the state received 31 million from the settlement. 15% of that was dedicated to EV charging. DES is currently the lead agency making decisions about that funding. And that is based on a lot of public comment and a plan that we had put in place when this funding first came to the state. And of note, this past September, we released a direct current fast charging funding opportunity in the form of a request for proposals. So this was a solicitation seeking projects to respond to, I mean, anybody could apply if they could meet the requirements of the funding opportunity. And we had designated specific highway corridors here in our state where we were hoping to see projects proposed along. Approximately 3 million of that 4.6 was dedicated towards this funding opportunity. And basically we were looking for, you know, applicants who could maybe partner with a site host or be the site host or partner with vendors. There was a lot of opportunity here for participation here in New Hampshire. And basically it was offering up to cover up to 80% of eligible costs for a site, or up to 100% of eligible costs for EV charging that's located at state or local government owned properties. So once again, a lot of support towards projects. So this solicitation did close in February on the 25th. And what I can share at this moment, because those proposals are currently being reviewed and scored, I can tell you that we had 14 applicants submit proposals for sites along our designated corridors for that award. And those will be obviously reviewed at this point. And what's exciting to see is that these came from private companies, companies that are specializing in renewable energy, even mom and pop stores. So it'll be exciting to see where that leads us. If you're interested in any detail about this funding opportunity, all of the documents are still on our VW webpage. So that's a link there. You can access that information. So the purpose for projects under the VW funding was to really kind of build a backbone of charging along our high transportation or travel corridors here in the state. So requirements were that there would be at least 2 direct current fast chargers plus co-located level 2 chargers. So we were looking for sites where they had the fast charging available for moving us into the future as EVs, like I said, are being made to accept a quicker charge, but also that level 2 charging for maybe older electric vehicles on the road that can accept the faster charge. And there's less and less of those. We were requiring that there was a minimum of 50 kilowatt DC fast charging at these sites. and that the connectors and that each of the stations had two of those, the two universal connectors, which were the CCS and Chatham connectors. We had identified 9 transportation corridors here in the state. That includes Route 16, which I know is near and dear to SRPC. And like I said, we're excited to kind of see what comes from this. Now enter another big force of funding, and that is coming through the bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed last November for $1.2 trillion. That's the whole BIL, right? That formerly this was called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We're now calling it the BIL, but basically the same thing. And this is really starting to dig into dedicating funding for transportation and infrastructure here in our country. So a little bit about the BIL investment into infrastructure. There was an EV charging action plan that was released by the current administration, and this identified a target that by 2030, US EV sales would represent 50% of new cars sold. So looking at that clock, we've got 8 years to build up the infrastructure to meet this anticipation as automakers are bringing more and committing more new models. I think 50 new electric vehicle models are going to be released this year alone. So as we're seeing this ramp up to 50% of new cars sold, that's a big number, right? So we've got some work to do. There's an effort to create this national EV charging network. There's a bunch of guidance that's been released. There are standards that are trying to be established to this, as I mentioned, this idea of focusing in on a specific universal connector. There's an initial focus along our designated corridors, and we'll get into that further. I mentioned the Volkswagen settlement had identified 9 corridors. There are others. And there is an effort to focus on what I call care, that this network of charging is convenient, affordable, reliable, and equitable. Through the BIL funding, there's going to be a lot of support that's needed, right, to get this network built out and to move this funding forward. And so through the BIL, there was the establishment of what is called a joint office of energy and transportation. And this is basically the Federal Department of Transportation and Federal Department of Energy coming together to bring all of that technical savviness that they have and all of the tools and resources that they have to join forces and basically support these projects. So there's a link to their website there, and I recommend that you go to that website and sign up for their mailing list to get in the loop. There's also a focus on EV batteries. There's a lot of concerns about battery life, about battery afterlife. So there is going to be an increased funding and effort to produce and reinforce domestic manufacturing opportunities, to source in an environmentally responsible way, to find ways to reuse or recycle these batteries, and to deploy other renewable energy opportunities such as energy storage or solar, co-located solar to support these projects. So expect a lot of advancements in technology over the next several years. So let's dig into that National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program a little bit further. And as I mentioned before, this is a program within that larger bipartisan infrastructure law funding. This is kind of the first effort to direct funding for EV charging, to direct it somewhere. And so we're going to find out where it's going to be, where that priority is going to be. So through the NEVI program, we see that the current administration has set a national goal of 500,000 EV chargers by 2030. And just for reference, we currently have 100,000 EV chargers out there. So we've got to increase that fourfold. The BIL is investing a total of $7.5 billion out of that $1.2 trillion total into a couple of different programs, one of which is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program. And this is where Mike Moser, who introduced himself from New Hampshire DOT, comes in, because this NEVI program, as we're calling it, is going to basically provide formula funds to New Hampshire's Department of Transportation, as well as Department of Transportations across the nation. So there's $5.5 billion being set aside for the NEVI program as a whole, $1 billion per year for the next 5 years. And that's beginning fiscal year 2022, so this October. New Hampshire's 5-year formula funding is going to be $17 million and change. In year one, we're looking at about $2.5 million. Now, this program, what we do know about it, is going to have a cost share of 80% federal funding, so that's coming through the NEVI program, and then a requirement that 20% of the funding is going to come through either private investment or state funds. Additionally, and here's an opportunity for what I see for the Stratford Regional Planning Commission communities, is that there is an additional 2.5 billion being directed towards a discretionary grant program. And that funding will be divided between, we broken down a little bit further and divided between a corridor focused program and a community charging focused program. And so opportunities for Stratford Regional Planning Commission is that within that community charging program, there's a focus on rural charging. There's a focus on access to underserved, overburdened, disadvantaged communities. We'll look a little bit more at what that means in a moment, but our rural areas here in New Hampshire, this may be an opportunity for us to tap into funding that helps support the build out of EV charging infrastructure. Just to go back to that NEVI program again, so this was that first 5 billion over 5 years that we're going to see initially launched. So the Joint Office of Department of Transportation and Energy have already released some guidance on this program, and that guidance document can be accessed on the Joint Office website. And what that guidance is telling us is that there's going to be some requirements, right, for states in order to get this funding. We have to develop a state plan. We have to look at what will determine eligible projects. Well, that's all going to be built into that plan. But additionally, through this guidance, the Joint Office is telling us what types of projects are going to be eligible. They're telling us how they want this program to be administered, and they're offering a lot of technical support and assistance as well. So I mentioned that we have to develop this deployment plan. So New Hampshire Department of Transportation, with Mike Moser as the point of contact, will be responsible for developing an EV infrastructure deployment plan. And that plan will be due by August 1st to the Joint Office. There's a lot built into this plan. There's going to be a lot of opportunity for public engagement. And initially, because this plan is due in a very short turnaround, what the Joint Office is looking for these plans to include is kind of our methodology. What is our process going to be to engage the public, to identify sites, et cetera? So there's going to be a lot of time and opportunity for communities to weigh in. So once again, more opportunities for Stratford Regional Planning Commission communities to start thinking about concerns that you might have or priorities that you might have that you might want to pass along to New Hampshire Department of Transportation. And DOT is going to be working with departments of environmental services and other stakeholders as well to pull that plan together and to ultimately move this program forward. So the funding prioritizes, as I mentioned before, the installation, operation, and maintenance of EV charging infrastructure, particularly with a focus on direct current fast charging. Once again, the focus is on these federal highways designated alternative fuel corridors. So this initial $5 billion of funding that's going to be coming is really going to be dedicated towards our interstate highway system initially, and then our national highway system secondary. So potential opportunities, for our communities, but really this initial bucket of funding is going to be more highway interstate focused. It's looking at these charging sites to be publicly accessible to, it's prioritizing rural and disadvantaged communities. What it wants to do is build up this network of direct current fast charging where every 50 miles there's a fast charging site, that these sites are within 1 mile of travel from the highway. So that's as the car travels, it's going to go to this site where there's direct current fast charging available. It's requiring a minimum of 4 150 kilowatt direct current fast chargers. So like I said, 50 kilowatts is on the lower end now. We're starting to see this push now to transition to a focus on 150 kilowatt DC fast chargers. And at these, at these stations, it's going to require combined charging system ports. It's not saying that you can't install CHAdeMO, that you can't have Tesla charging stations there, but the funding for this program will really be directed towards these 150 kilowatt direct current fast charging stations that are equipped with the combined charging system ports. So as I mentioned, now an attempt to kind of standardize fast charging. And what these ports have to be capable of doing is charging 4 EVs at one time. So really high speed charging sites. They're going to need a lot of power supply to support them. Now, what's exciting about this funding is Once this national network is completely built out, states are going to be able to, departments of transportation will be able to look at potentially offering that funding towards other charging sites, and we'll have flexibility to determine type and location. So that's pending whether or not all that funding will get spent on interstates and national highway systems. If there's any remaining, there may be opportunities for the state to look at other sites and maybe other levels of charging, like level 2 and potentially places within communities, but not a guarantee, right? Still too early to know. So regarding the state infrastructure deployment plan that I mentioned is required under the NEVI program, a template was released on March 2nd that provides some guidance to the state on what we need to pull together to submit this plan. It describes state agency coordination and development of the plan. It's identifying who the state should be working with to develop this plan. It's describing a public engagement process and how that is supposed to be incorporated into the plan. It's requiring us to articulate our vision and goals with that 5-year horizon in mind. It's asking us to analyze our existing deployment. Where do we currently have charging, and what are risks and challenges to building that out? It's asking us to present a deployment strategy for installations on our corridors. And like I said, it's prioritizing our high traffic transportation corridors, our interstates like I-93, I-95, and then beyond that, our national highway system. It's asking us to identify non-federal funding sources, to consider socio-demographic, geographic, and economic equity. Equity is a big component of this. You may have heard of the Justice 40 initiative that's been launched by the federal government, requiring that 40% of the benefits of the funding be felt in disadvantaged communities. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the 40% has to be spent in disadvantaged communities, but that the benefits are experienced by those communities. And there actually are tools that are being released to help us identify these communities, like EPA's environmental justice screening tool, or the EJ screen. These plans will need to be updated on an annual basis. So it's a living document, opportunity for public engagement along the way, and for building out that plan as we go. Now I want to touch on the other $2.5 billion of the total infrastructure funding for EVs, and that is the discretionary grant program. So just to go back real quick, there's $7.5 billion in EV charging infrastructure funding that's coming. The NEVI program is using $5 billion of that, and now we have the discretionary grant program, which will use $2.5 billion of that. And I should pretty much say that that $7.5 billion total is really more focused on infrastructure, not necessarily electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And that's where this comes into play. So NEVI program, all EV focused. The discretionary grant program, EV focused, but also incorporates opportunities to build out fueling infrastructure for other alternative fuels like propane and natural gas. So the discretionary grant program is where I see opportunities for Stratford Regional Planning Commission communities. This is that $2.5 billion. It will be a competitive grant program, and it's going to be broken down into 2 buckets. Corridor charging, so once again, continuing that focus of build out along our corridors, and community charging component. So $1.25 billion to the corridors. This will once again be for publicly accessible charging and fueling infrastructure, and along our designated alternative fuel corridors. We'll get to that in a moment. And then $1.25 billion for community charging. And that's going to be, once again, for publicly accessible EV charging, as well as other alternative fuels like hydrogen, propane, and natural gas. This will be focused in communities with priorities. I can't say it enough, of a huge equity focus for this funding. So rural communities will have opportunities, low and moderate income neighborhoods, and they've also identified communities with a low ratio of private parking spaces. That's really all we know about this program right now. We are expecting additional guidance to come. There's been just a lot of focus on that initial National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI program. So we're waiting for more information about this program, but this is where I do believe there will be opportunities for our communities here in New Hampshire. So we anticipate more funding coming likely in November of this year. So what don't we know about these two major programs, NEVI and then the discretionary program? We don't really know what the minimum standards and requirements for EV charging projects the maintenance or the data collection component will be. There's a lot of technical details that still need to be fleshed out, but the U.S. Department of Transportation will be publishing further guidance by May 13th of this year. We're awaiting this future notice of funding opportunity for that discretionary program, which is the competitive charging for communities and along corridors. We're waiting to hear more about details of a 10% set aside for networked gap filling grants. So this is also within that larger funding. 10% has been set aside to be used by the U.S. Department of Energy to fill gaps in the highway infrastructure. So we need to learn more about that. We also don't know where the Buy America requirements stand. So with the federal funding, there are Buy America requirements as well as NEPA requirements that are in place to where all of this funding needs to meet these standards. Now, Buy America standards unfortunately have been somewhat ambiguous over the years. I think Federal Highways or the U.S. Department of Transportation had released a request for information to kind of find out where charging station companies stood in terms of, did they believe they met Buy America requirements? There's also a request for, really what does Buy America mean? Is it every nut and bolt of a charging station, for example, being made in America? But because there is such a focus on this program funding a national network that's America made and supported to create more jobs and grow out a workforce, Buy America is going to play a big role. So stay tuned for more information on that, because the challenge is that we don't really know if a lot of these EV charging companies meet these requirements as they currently stand. So we need to kind of get more information on that. And we also need to learn a little bit more about what the criteria will be for fully building out these corridors. As I mentioned, if we don't spend all of the $5 billion funding from the NEVI program after we've built out our corridors, there could be an opportunity for us to designate other sites and other levels of charging. But we have to fully build out those corridors first. So what does fully built out mean? We're still waiting for more information on that. So I mentioned a lot about our corridors. I believe I've done presentations on it before, but let's just dig into it again, because really that's where this initial tranche of funding is really going to be focused. So many years ago, back in I think 2016, the Federal Highway Administration came out with an alternative fuel corridor designation program. And this was to identify a nationwide network of alternative fueling travel corridors that states could nominate within their states for designation by Federal Highways. So basically what this required us to do with this EV, let's keep an electric vehicle focus on this for now, is this required us to identify our transportation corridors here in the state. That could be interstates, US routes, F.E. Everett Turnpike, for example, and to look at the existing charging infrastructure along those corridors, and then look at criteria set by Federal Highways to see if the existing infrastructure allowed that corridor to be considered a fully built out corridor, which means it met the requirements or the criteria that the Federal Highways had set for, let's say, charging every so many miles and within a certain distance of the highways, or if it didn't meet that, it could be designated as a pending corridor. And so for reference, this map shows our ready corridors in green and our pending corridors in orange. The challenge is that the criteria had changed over the years. So when we initially designated I-93, for example, the criteria allowed that level 2 chargers could be considered as meeting the needs for transportation along that corridor. As the years went on and we continued to participate in the designation process, that criteria changed to only DC fast charging could be used to meet the needs of a corridor having sufficient infrastructure. The beauty of the NEVI funding, all this funding that's coming, is regardless of whether our corridors are ready or pending, that does not play a role. It's all about whether or not these corridors are designated, because designated corridors are going to be allowed to receive funding. Non-designated corridors, you can't use the funding on. So irregardless of the ready or pending status, we've identified a bunch of corridors here in New Hampshire. So a lot of the legwork has already been done. And a big shout out to the New Hampshire Department of Transportation for partnering with DES on these corridor designations over the last several years. It's been an integral partnership and is obviously serving us well as we're moving forward into this NEVI funding that's coming. So I have a couple of slides here on our existing alternative fuel corridors, because not only do we designate corridors for electric vehicle charging, but we also designated corridors for compressed natural gas, propane, CNG and propane. Those were the other two. So a bunch of corridor designations already exist. If you're interested in learning more, I'll share the link here to the Grant State Clean Cities newsletter. I wrote a big article on it and kind of delved into where our corridors are. But of note for SRPC is that State Route 16 is currently designated as an EV pending from Portsmouth to the New Hampshire Maine border, and also has a propane pending designation on it from Portsmouth to Rochester. But as I mentioned, pending at this point, all of these corridors really are pending because they don't meet the current requirements of the NEVI program and also of the existing corridor nomination that was recently opened. So as I mentioned, Federal Highways has been administering these solicitations for nominations over the last several years of corridors. And so we've participated in 3 of those nomination programs and designated a bunch of our corridors as a result. So now the new standards for the existing open corridor solicitation is aligning with the NEVI program. So basically, once again, a focus on public DC fast charging, no farther than 50 miles apart, no more than 1 mile from the highway as a car can drive. These stations would be equipped with CCS. So as we're looking at our existing corridors, none of them meet these minimum requirements. So we are currently here at DES and DOT looking at our existing corridor designations and trying to determine if there are other corridors that we may want to nominate through this open solicitation. That effort is happening right now. What else I want to call out here? You know, the opportunity through the NEVI funding is that any existing infrastructure on these corridors may be eligible for funding to upgrade it to these new standards of, once again, you know, 4 150 kilowatt DC fast chargers, 50 miles apart, et cetera. You know, meeting those requirements, we'll be able to use that funding to not only build out new sites, but to potentially also upgrade existing sites. So currently along our corridors, we do have a few station sites that meet the requirements set through the NEVI program, which means 1 mile off the exit with 4 of those combined charging system ports at these 150 kilowatt stations. And so those exist currently in West Lebanon, Manchester, Nashua, Salem, and Seabrook. So once again, our DC fast charging really focused on the seacoast and along our Vermont border. So a lot of opportunity around the state. So planning and partnering, I really came here today to talk to you guys about what you can be thinking about, how you can plan for this funding. And to do that, one of the big key partnerships, I believe, in moving any charging project forward is going to be working with your utility. So identifying who your utility is and really kind of understanding as you're identifying or thinking about sites that may work for charging within your communities. Are there any sites that meet the requirement of along our corridors within 1 mile off of the highway? Thinking about those types of sites, also thinking within your community about where public charging would make sense. So the beauty of the Volkswagen funding and this RFP, this funding opportunity that recently closed through the VW program, is that DES had developed some utility assessment forms, which I think could help inform the types of questions that you may want to be thinking about as you're identifying sites and trying to determine what is the existing electrical capacity or electrical supply at those sites and what's going to be needed to make those sites feasible for charging in your community, whether that's level 2 charging or direct current fast charging. There are questions that the utility can help you answer. So those documents are accessible on the VW webpage, and they may help to identify some of the kinds of questions that you may want to be asking the utility once you have identified a site and kind of want to understand what is the existing electrical capacity at that site. In terms of connecting with your utility, I've asked this in the past, and the utilities say, look at the account representative listed on your utility bill, and that is the first point of contact for any inquiries about a site within your community. There also is additional funding and incentives that I want to highlight that may help beef up projects that you may have already had in mind for EV charging that maybe just don't work under the funding that's coming through the BIL. So utilities have actually made great efforts to try to create some electric vehicle friendly policies and opportunities within their utility structure. And obviously the utilities here in the state, many of them are governed by our Public Utilities Commission. They need to submit annual rate cases to request to be able to use any of their funds to develop these programs. A lot of times they have to submit separate dockets in order to get approval from the PUC to develop these programs. And I will just highlight that Eversource currently has a docket proposing a demand charge alternative. If you're not familiar with demand charges, this can happen when you have that kind of high capacity direct current fast charging infrastructure on your property, and maybe it's not currently being used frequently because we are still growing our EV residents driving electric vehicles here in the state. There's about 4,800 registered electric vehicles currently in the state, but we do obviously see a lot of folks coming in from Canada and surrounding states, visitors that are driving EVs coming to our state. The challenge, however, is if you have a site in a rural area, for example, where there's not a lot consistent electric vehicles coming through and charging, and all of a sudden you have an electric vehicle pull up and decide to soup up at that site, that draw on the electricity could potentially trigger something called a demand charge. This actually happened in the town of Derry, where they had a charging site that they ended up having to shut down temporarily, and they're kind of trying to work through the challenges there because what was happening is that the infrequent use of that site when someone would pull up to charge was triggering this extra electrical demand charge on their utility bill, and that just wasn't working for their business case for that site. So something to keep in mind, and the utilities are currently aware of that and trying to propose alternatives to the demand charges to kind of help make the business case in the interim. There's also an effort to create make-ready programs. This is building out all of the electrical supply that would lead up to you putting the charging station on top of it. So the conduit, the transformers, all of that. There's also an effort to create time of use rates, and this is particularly important for EV drivers and could help offset demand charges because it's trying to incentivize EV drivers to charge when it's not a peak time for the grid, right? When maybe overnight when the grid isn't having so much demand on it. So there's efforts right now to bolster our grid to try to alleviate some of the challenges that we face with demand charges in the interim and with the cost and expense of constructing these sites. So utilities are going to be a big partner and big player in all of this. One utility who doesn't have oversight from the PUC, who has kind of already moved forward on the EV front, is the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative. And if you're a member of the co-op, you probably are aware that you can access rebates for EVs and EV charging through the co-op. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a rural business development grant program. This is great for rural areas. So once again, SRPC, I believe you fall into that category, could access funding through USDA for charging in your community if you can get support from local businesses saying, if the community installs a charging station here, it's going to help support an EV workforce. So folks that are driving EVs that are coming to work in your community. So consider looking into that. If you've got questions, I'm happy to answer them. And that's all I have for you right now. A bunch of opportunity, and hopefully I've given you some keys to be thinking about what you can do to engage with this funding or to plan for this funding or to even just move your project forward as it stands now. But a lot is coming and I'm excited to have been able to share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Questions? Questions from JAG members?
lot to digest.
It's all very interesting, because I don't have any specific questions.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot to digest right now, right? Yeah.
Those on the Zoom platform, usually raise your hand so we can know whether you have a question or not, please.
I was glad to see Route 4 on there. I know, I think in the previous meeting, we had concern that that might not have been included. So it's good.
I like to say we've got you covered, right? We've really done a lot to try to make sure we address all of those main arteries of travel here in the state. So
Also, I'm sure other questions will come up as we move forward, and I'll pass them along to you, Jessica, if I don't have the answer. We've already gotten a bunch of submissions from folks for potential sites. And I'll start talking about, you know, the next little dash on the agenda there. If you haven't seen, we've started our regional effort to solicit new sites or potential sites with a focus on the proximity to the highways, to those designated corridors or to a major highway, but also just wanted to collect as many potential sites as possible for those future discretionary programs. And as the build out happens, didn't want to be exclusive to those fast charging sites, because there may be other sites that are better suited for level 2, which represents a much smaller investment on a municipality or a business, and maybe just more appropriate if people are going to be there longer. So that's kind of where we are, just collecting sites. And if you have comments that you would like to submit, do you, Michael or Jessica, do you know offhand at this point, I know it's still early, when the first opportunities for public comment on that state plan would be? Because I've collected a handful of comments from folks so far. I know it's still early, so if you have an idea.
I'll defer to Mike.
Yeah, I figured you were going to do that. Thanks, Jessica. I think, as Jessica said, you know, we're really in the early parts of the plan right now. Unfortunately, this is a really quick turnaround. Plans have to be submitted by August 1st. You know, in talking with the joint office that Jessica mentioned, Joint Office Transportation and Energy, our plan is really going to be, you know, we're going to describe what we're going to do. So we're definitely going to be reaching out to the RPOs throughout the state before August 1st. We're trying to work out the schedule and the timeframes for that to happen right now. But in addition to that, after August 1st, there's going to continue to be communication. We're going to reach out. This is a 5-year program. We are not planning on building everything out, you know, in the next 12 months. You know, that this is going to be a process going down the road. So I don't want anybody to feel like everything's got to be done, you know, before August 1st. Really what we need to do is, you know, develop our plan, figure out what our outreach is going to be. You know, the guidance that was initially provided to us in February, there was, you know, on the order of 40 or 50 different groups that they recommend we reach out to from the US DOT. Obviously, you know, we're gonna have a hard time doing that, you know, getting all the comments together and squaring everything away in a short amount of time. So with that said, I don't have a great answer for that. Some of this is gonna, you know, go through the Transportation Council. We may look at doing a hearing through there. We may look at doing one, a secondary one outside of the Transportation Council. You know, things are still up in the air right now. I'm hoping that by the end of April, we'll have a much better idea of the schedule and any opportunities that, you know, the RPOs will be able to provide for this, so.
Well, I have a question, and it has to do with the municipal site identification. Do you know if the identification of sites where there's existing gasoline refueling stations, is that being discouraged as a potential site for either level 2 or direct charge stations.
I don't think that it's being discouraged. I mean, the beauty of existing gas stations is that you pretty much have a lot of that electrical supply that's needed to reinforce putting charging stations that are obviously going to need electricity at those sites. The challenge with those sites is that oftentimes, I mean, you have a convenience store there, but with EV charging, it still takes 20 to 30 minutes to really get the juice that you might need to move on to your next, destination. So for a site that has a convenience store, I don't know if it's the ideal place for someone to be hanging out for a half an hour or so. So, we really kind of are looking at sites where maybe someone's going to visit a restaurant or it has something nearby that they can walk to, like a restaurant or stores that they can visit. Definitely not being discouraged, but when we think about ideal places for charging, we want to invite economic investment, right, in that area. So we want to think about places where folks that are driving EVs may want to spend money to shop and buy food and, places that are maybe destinations like ski areas and places like that. So I don't think any locations being discouraged, but think big.
The paradigm for today's refueling station is not just convenience store today. A lot of times you'll see three things there. You'll see the refueling, the convenience, and you'll also see some kind of a sandwich shop or a coffee shop where people could spend that 30 minutes. And it seems to me that not only is the infrastructure and the power requirement there, but the location closer to the highways is there in some cases, in addition to the infrastructure already being in place, such as the curb cuts and the space for those 4 or more charging locations. So I think that what I was trying to get to is the early guidance on this talked about it being municipal property or controlled by the municipality, but I'm really trying to find out if it's a private business and private property, that it meets all the other requirements. Is that an appropriate site to at least identify?
And I would say, I think that it is. Obviously, we're still early in with guidance, but the Volkswagen program incentivized, I think, what you were referring to as state-owned sites or municipal-owned sites. But the NEVI program, that's really an 80-20 match, right? So 80% of funds coming through NEVI and then 20% state and private. So there's going to be obviously a need for private investment in those types of partnerships. So I don't think there's any sense of discouraging any potential sites at this point, but we're just very early in to trying to identify what the requirements are going to be for identifying sites. So nothing's off the table as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if you want to add anything there, Mike.
No, I think you summed it up pretty well. At this point, we're open to suggestions, whether it be municipal, whether it be private. If it's on state property, we have to take a closer look at that. So if there's any rest areas or so forth, there is a non-commercialization of the interstate system. So we need to be a little bit careful about that. But, from a municipal or a private side, I think at this point we'd be looking at either one.
And I think, Bruce, you might be, if you're talking about the municipally owned sites, that was sort of our recommendation, Stratford Regional Planning for permitting, for the ease of permitting. If funding was available tomorrow, could you get a permit for that site easily? Where private may have third parties, but also, thinking about places like a large grocery store, commercial site that may be open to that and would make an obvious spot for a charger.
Thank you.
When someone stops and charges their vehicle, do they pay market rate for the electricity they use these sites?
Hey.
Yeah, I think it's,
Yes.
and I think it'll totally vary. Like Jessica was talking about demand charges. The one time I charged not at home, it was at night in a small rural community, and it was $12. So I don't know what the exact rate was, but I think that's all that's way up in the air at this point. Whether, I think that it might have been Sam Evans Brown from Clean Energy New Hampshire that we met with recently, who said that if a town is putting in those chargers, in most cases, they're eating those demand charges when they come up. They aren't getting passed on to consumers, at least initially.
Seems like that we could build out the charging network faster if the consumer paid the price, because you would have less disincentive for someone to put a charging site at the location.
And also he made the point that the more EVs we have, the cheaper it's going to be. So, yeah, that is a challenge at this point.
And then was Route 125 on that list? That one seems like for our region a lost opportunity.
It's a no-brainer.
That and Route 11. So
Route 11 was on the list.
It was on the list, but I don't believe it's currently designated at this point. I think Tim might.
Route 11 is. Route 11 is designated.
Okay, so then 125, I'll research the nomination process and see what that.
I was just gonna say that I agree with the level 2 charges, that having it by a restaurant and a location, that kind of thing, is really, really vital, because that way you can make that time work. But if you are in a car and you stop for 20 minutes, you go in, you go to the bathroom, as long as you have a bathroom and a cup of coffee or whatever, social media is gonna eat that time up in no time. So I really don't, like, I don't think we have to get too concerned. I mean, that's what people do, right? You can do TikTok and you'll wish you could charge more. So I just think that as long as there's the basics necessities, it doesn't have to be a full.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say that, there's emphasis on these sites being publicly accessible. There's emphasis on them being networked. So anticipate that people will be paying to charge for the charging. And, another thing that Colin brought up that's a really good point is, are you aware of your community's permitting process for EV charging? A lot of times what we've heard from electricians and installers is that the permitting process is kind of a hang up for them to build out charging stations in the community. So making sure that the requirements for permitting EV charging are posted somewhere accessible to vendors and installers to electricians who need to pull these permits for EV charging, and that there's a clearly defined process of what's required, the inspection process, the costs, et cetera, that's clearly defined. So that's another thing that communities can kind of work on right now to make sure that permitting is has a clear process associated with it.
I remembered one of my other question. You mentioned state or private funds for match are for the NEVI program. Are VW funds going to be available as part of that, the state funding to potentially match projects?
I don't think there's been any, I don't think we've gotten that far in discussion, and I think Tim just unmuted. I'll let him jump in here. Tim White.
Yeah, Colin, I honestly don't know. I don't see any reason off the top of my head why Volkswagen funds wouldn't be used as match for projects principally funded through the NEVI program. But I mean, that's probably a question that's going to start to get asked more and more now that the NEVI program is underway. So perhaps we should try and get some clarification on that from the trustee.
Hey, Tim, I just want to follow up with that. That question has been asked of the joint committee. We are waiting for an answer on that right now. The initial response we got was no, but we're trying to verify that before we can give a final answer.
Sounds good. Are you done with your part?
I am.
Okay, so we're moving on to item 5 on the agenda, other business, which I assume includes any updates from TAC member communities.
Yes, I have a few things I can go through real quick first. Just a reminder that I sent out a solicitation email for 10-year plan projects or for venture plan projects that can be vetted for a year from now. We'll be submitting new projects for the 10-year plan. We have engineering support now that can help with those if there are projects that float to the top locally. A couple other funding programs coming up, reminders. I think I've mentioned this before, but we have through the grapevine, understand that there's going to be a CMAQ round later this year, later in the fall. That's congestion mitigation air quality program. So in the past projects, like improving traffic signal timing along the corridor, just improving an intersection outright so that there's less waiting involved, because cars waiting means more emissions locally. A pretty wide range of things are eligible. Non-motorized trails, if it gets people out of their cars onto human-powered options, as well as public transit improvements. So we'll have to wait for more information from DOT on that one, but that is coming up. And then since the FAST Act was implemented, DOT has alternated years between CMAQ and transportation alternatives. So I anticipate sometime maybe in 2023 to have a TAP route as well. So that's any non-motorized transportation project. So like last couple of things. The New Hampshire Municipal Association is hosting a webinar on April 4th. That's this Monday. On the state crossover date for legislation. So it's just, they call it a halftime show, just kind of neat. So just kind of the state of legislation that's pending. That's on their website, it's free. I'm signed up and I'm thinking that's going to be pretty interesting. And then last thing, the state DOT is anticipating, they have a deadline for their state bike ped plan of May 22nd. That got all kind of snarled up with the pandemic, but they're in the final stages now. So that's going to be coming out, and look forward to that. That's it.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else have any other business? Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you to Stratford Regional Planning Commission. They came in and digitized all of our records, the scan team, and I think Steven's on there. He did an excellent job, and the whole team did. We got all of our planning files scanned. So, yeah.
So I don't know, I'll speak for Stephen. I will say, and this is, Somersworth is a good example for other communities. I heard that you all were extremely organized and helpful in keeping things organized to make it go faster. So that was part of the success in getting through as much as they did.
And that was all because of Dana Crossley, our secretary.
We'll take it.
Be sure to give your cheat sheet to somebody else.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right, let's move on to citizens forum, which I will identify that there are no citizens in the room physically, and I don't know if there's any out there on Zoom hiding in the black part of the screen. The answer is no, so we're going to move on to the last item on the agenda, which is a motion to.
We can just leave because we don't have.
No motion. We're all going to just leave. Thanks, everybody out in Zoom world.
Have a good weekend, all. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Jessica and Jim and Mike.
Thank
We're
you.
done.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.